Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We are going to be previewing the Week 15 matchups while discussing some of the Week 14 stats that happened and how that affects the upcoming week. Welcome to the start of the fantasy football playoffs. To anyone that plays in leagues where 6 or 8 teams make the playoffs, Ryan, I'll kick it to you. Let's start with a very disappointing Thursday game.
Yeah, the Justin Herbert injury changes to one. Raiders versus Chargers on Thursday. The Raiders are now 3-point favorites. The game total is a blistering 34 total points. When we're talking about the Raiders, Josh, they got shut out by Minnesota at home last week. There's no real way to, view that through rose-colored glasses. The one positive I'll say about the Raiders, they only gave up 3 points. The defense has been much better than I expected throughout the year. Do you have anything positive to say about Aiden O'Connell's offense?
No, I don't. Devontae Adams is now under 13 fantasy points a game. That is not even really a top 24 fantasy option. Josh Jacobs has a knee injury. We'll learn more about that later today, and we'll touch on that on our waiver wire show tomorrow. Zamir White will probably be a priority pickup.
For Josh's beloved Chargers, I don't really want to watch this team without Justin Herbert. We saw them score 6 points in New England a couple weeks ago. Again, the Chargers are 3-point road underdogs for a reason here, Josh. I'm not even sure that's enough without Herbert. What are you thinking here for the Chargers?
Yeah, I don't have much positives to say. The only positive would really be Austin Eckler. There was this fake news report the Chargers would ride the hot hand. Austin Eckler had 48 snaps to Isaiah Spiller's 12 to Josh Kelly's 7. Eckler is the one who had the red zone and goal line carries. He's the one that had all 7 targets, ultimately finished with 21 fantasy points and 100 total yards. Spiller and Kelly combined for 2.5 fantasy points. I don't think we need to say too much about Quentin Johnston. A lot of people want to talk about it. Guys, he had 4 targets. That's a 10% target share. He caught 3 for 91 yards. Most of it was on 1 catch. That is living very dangerously for fantasy football. We will still not be starting him against a decent Raiders secondary.
That's Jay Larky Tweets. You can find his fantasy rankings at the33rdteam.com. Kevin Wheeler, Matthew Hill also joining on the rankings. I do defenses. That'll be released on Tuesday afternoon and updated throughout the week. We have a Saturday slate this week, Josh. First up on that one, Bengals versus Vikings. Spreads here is Bengals -4. Game total here is 39.5 points. Josh, we say this all the time. I watch all the games so you don't have to. And I want to talk about Jake Browning's outing here. Chase Brown and Joe Mixon accounted for 126 receiving yards. 99 of those came on 2 busted screen plays. Around 20 more came on another screen. 46 other yards came on a deep shot to T. Higgins where Jake Browning almost threw him out of bounds. If he leads him, probably like a 70-yard touchdown. Got to give him his flowers. He's been very productive 2 weeks in a row, but a lot of last week's statistical production was unsustainable. I wouldn't bank on it. The game 2 weeks ago against the Jaguars, we can count that when he played it well. Last week, this was more like a 2-10, 1 touchdown type outing. What are you thinking about the Bengals here, Josh?
I'm still pretty sick, but I'm going to try and show the passion that Jake Browning's game plans have not been real NFL starting quarterback game plans. His average throw depth these past 3 games has been 5.1 yards, 4.5 yards, and 4.5 yards. Overall, that is under 5 yards on average. Bryce Young has the lowest average throw depth among full-time starters. His average throw depth is 6 yards. 6 yards, so it's about 30% more than Browning. That is not very sustainable in terms of yardage. Yeah, that might offer some PPR value to the running backs, but in terms of Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, that's really not what you want, to have such a low throw depth. And then on Chase Brown, he's explosive, but it is still Joe Mixon's backfield. Mixon outsnapped him more than 2-1. Mixon outcarried him more than 2-1. Mixon had 5 goal line carries. Chase Brown did not have any of them, and Mixon still ran more routes. So we can't really start Chase Brown yet in fantasy. He's had a couple big plays these last 2 weeks. Ultimately, though, this feels a lot like Keaton Mitchell, where you start to get excited, and then 1 or 2 big plays don't happen. You're left with 7 or 8 touches, and you realize that you're getting 6 fantasy points.
Yeah, I'd say Brown's a stash at this point. And, we're deep enough into the year where stashes are almost unnecessary in a week or two. With the Vikings, Josh, we just mentioned this. They beat the Raiders 3-0. They shut them out. All the credit in the world to Brian Flores. If you're going to talk about the best coordinator this year, it's Brian Flores. The Vikings are giving up the 5th fewest points in the league now. They were giving up the 8th last week. So it's not like the shutout just, catapulted them to extreme heights. They've been really good all year for about 2 months. Just remarkable stuff for a defense that got shredded by Mac Jones and Daniel Jones twice last year, Josh. You made a little money on those Daniel Jones outings, actually. Offensively, though, Josh Jobs has turned into a pumpkin over the last 2 weeks. I still think that they should roll him out because he has more upside. He was pretty consistent with the Cardinals all year. So any of their other options, I'm a little concerned about. This game I like is an under. 2 very good defensive coordinators, probably 2 of the 5 best defensive coordinators in the league facing off against backup quarterbacks. What do you like anything about the Vikings here, Josh?
Yeah, I was going to say, so Josh Dobbs was benched for Nick Mullins. He had 63 passing yards on 23 attempts. That's under 3 yards per attempt. He had the hospital ball to Justin Jefferson, which led to the injury. The one thing that we can say positively, Alexander Mattison has a sprained ankle. That's not the positive. The positive is Ty Chandler. We'll talk about him more on tomorrow's waiver wire show, but I'd say he's in for a pretty big day. The Bengals have struggled recently against running backs, and Ty Chandler projects to get all the touches because this depth chart at this point is so hollowed out. We had Cam Akers lost to the Achilles. Dalvin Cook is no longer on this team. Madison has the high ankle sprain. It's basically just Ty Chandler. And then next up is Kanan Wongwu, who's a special teamer. So I think the undersized, explosive Chandler's in for 15 to 20 touches in this game.
Next up, Josh, Colts versus Steelers. Colts are 2.5-point home favorites. Game total here is 42 points. It's funny, Josh. For 13 weeks, I resisted the Colts record. I was like, this team's overachieving. I don't know how they're doing this. I finally move them up to, I think, 12th in my power rankings, finally give them their flowers, so to speak. And then all of a sudden, in Cincinnati last week, they show up as the team I've thought they were all year. So it wouldn't surprise me. They're a bit like last year's Giants to me. Very well coached. Shane Steichen, no, all the credit in the world to him, but they win a lot of games by very, unsustainable ways. They're not a great roster. I could see them bottoming out over the next few weeks. What do you think about the Colts here, Josh?
Yeah, the one guy I want to talk about is Zach Moss. The past 2 games, Zach Moss has 32 of the 35 running back carries, 11 of the 14 targets per game. That's 16 carries and 5.5 targets. That's 21.5 opportunities a game. He's under 9 fantasy points per game in that stretch. He's still a fantasy RB1 based on usage. Steelers have not really shut down running backs. In fantasy, we just saw that last Thursday with Ezekiel Elliott having a season-high 27 fantasy points. So Zach Moss, we should continue to roll him out very, very confidently in this matchup.
One thing I'll say about the Colts too, Josh, my power rankings will be released tomorrow morning. I'll talk about this a little bit in there. Their schedule's soft enough where I do think they could still make the playoffs, but this is still not just not a very good team. Speaking of teams that are just not very good in their present state, we have the Steelers. What a horrifying loss to the Patriots at home on Thursday night last week. I think Steeler fans that want to get rid of Mike Tomlin, the grass is not always greener, ladies and gentlemen. I think maybe just, a better offensive coordinator, maybe a better quarterback in the next few years, and keep the guy who hasn't had a losing season yet. That's just my 2 cents. That said, Josh, I think Mitch Trubisky's at the point where maybe he's not on a roster next year. It's been bad, and it was really, really bad last Thursday night. Do we have any hope for improvement here with the Steelers offense at all?
Probably not on the Trubisky end. I enjoyed the calls for Mason Rudolph. I think that shows you how bad the season's going when there's calls for the 3rd-string quarterback to start getting reps on a Thursday night game. Positively, though, the Colts are the second-best matchup for fantasy running backs when you adjust for their schedule. We should get a nice little bounce back for Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren. Last week against the Patriots, they combined just 19 carries, just 40 rushing yards total. They'd been really, really hot for 5 weeks prior to that. I think they get back on track here, and I think we're going to see even more of an extreme run-heavy game plan, assuming the Colts don't do what the Patriots do and jump out to a multi-touchdown lead early. I think it's pretty much in the Steelers' intentions at this point to have 15 to 20 Trubisky pass attempts, and ideally, I think they're going to have 35 running back carries in this one.
It makes all the sense in the world to me. This Thursday, Josh and I will be back on our podcast here where we'll discuss some of his ranking disparities versus consensus. We'll see where he's at in the Steelers running back room since we're in playoff mode now, too. We'll expand that a little bit. Lions versus Broncos closes out the Saturday slate, Josh. Lions are 4-point home favorites. Game total here is 46.5. One of my stronger stances over the last couple months is that I've viewed Detroit as being overvalued. They're a good team, but they're not quite in that upper echelon. That's aged pretty well over the last few weeks with losses to the Packers and Bears now. In fact, with the Bears, they've played them twice recently, and for 118 out of 120 minutes, the Bears not only beat them up, but dominated them. Bears dominated them in Chicago last week. And one of the things here with Jared Goff is we're heading down the stretch here in a bad weather. If Jared Goff is clean, he'll shred you. If he's under duress at all like he was last week, he's an entirely different quarterback. He's a very pressure-sensitive quarterback. Keep that in mind going forward when you're playing matchups. What do you got here in the lines, Josh?
Yeah, at this point, it seems like game script is dictating a lot of the running back usage for Detroit. Teams in control. David Montgomery gets a lot more of the work. When they're trailing, Jahmyr Gibbs is the guy. We kind of see that each week. Broncos have not really been a team that's blowing out opponents. I think we're going to forget last week's game against the Chargers because Herbert left that game early with the broken finger. So in this one, Lions 4-point favorites. I would lean towards Montgomery slightly. And the Broncos are the number one defense to target for fantasy running backs when you adjust for the schedule and opponents face. So Montgomery will probably be a top 10 running back for me this week in fantasy. My rankings will hit the site tomorrow, the33rdteam.com.
Yeah, we'll talk about that Thursday too, maybe, Josh, because this is kind of an important game here. Like you said, the Broncos were actually beating the Chargers before Herbert went down. I don't think that really changed the outcome here. The offense is still a middle-of-the-road group here, so I don't think they push Detroit much. But like you said, I do think, and the Lions, they do this well, premium offensive line, 2 excellent running backs. But on the Broncos side, Russell, the Lions defense is really underwhelmed over the last month or so, really, truly underwhelmed. So if Russell Wilson's going to get a spike week, is it this week, Josh? What are you thinking here with Denver?
Yeah, I think there's real potential there. Dome game. The Lions have now allowed at least 26 points in 5 straight games. And when you look at their opponents, it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, we've got the Saints, the Packers, the Bears twice. It's not like they're getting destroyed by these premium offenses. So I think there's at least some hope for Russ to have another good game and just kind of continue this sort of low-end fantasy QB1 type season that he's had based on efficiency and then much more heavily reliant on his legs than last year. And then in the receiving game, there's potential here. Detroit's become this big pass funnel defense. 3rd best matchup for quarterbacks, 6th best matchup for receivers, but 31st for running backs. And it's kind of been a tale of Sutton being incredibly efficient and Jeudy being inefficient all season. Jeudy led the team last week with 6 targets, 20% share, but he only caught 2 for 16 yards, whereas Sutton only had 4 targets, caught 3 for 62 yards and a touchdown. Courtland Sutton quietly has now reached double-digit touchdowns this year, which blew my mind. 53 receptions, so every 5 catches Sutton has gotten in the box this year, and I don't think that's sustainable.
That's Larky tweets. I don't think that's sustainable either. Now we're on to the Sunday slate here, Josh. First up is Browns versus Bears. Cleveland's a 3.5-point home favorite right now. Game total here is 38 points. My expert picks and predictions comes out on Thursday morning. This is the game I'm looking forward to diving in the most because I think this is an either-or game currently. On the Browns side of things, Josh, Joe Flacco has transformed this team. I think not only are they going to get into the playoffs now, I think they could be frisky. I think they could knock someone off because, they don't really even need much of them. But he threw for over 300 yards last week. And on top of that, Josh, Joe Flacco throughout his career has loved tight ends from Dennis Pitta to Tyler Conklin in New York last week. They see big-time volume. David Njoku's a dynamic athlete that had a pretty big spike game last week. I'm curious about what your thoughts on Flacco and Njoku here and on Cleveland's offense in general.
Yeah, Flacco's been a revelation. First time this year the Browns have had at least 250 passing yards in back-to-back games. Thank you, Joe Flacco. Multiple passing touchdowns in each of those as well. I'll push back a little bit on him loving tight ends. David Njoku did have 6 catches, 91 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's very exciting. Njoku dudded out last week. And actually, the 6 games prior to Flacco, And Njoku's target share was always at least 20%. It's been under that in both games with Flacco. So we did have a very, very efficient game last week. But in terms of actually targeting the tight end, we've actually seen Flacco leaning much more heavily on the wide receivers. In this game where Amari Cooper did not leave with a head injury, he was the target leader, 14 targets, a 33% share. He only caught 7 for 77 yards. So we now have back-to-back weeks where Elijah Moore is the clear target leader. Doesn't do much. He's a little inefficient. Amari Cooper, same thing. Gets all the targets, not super efficient. I like to think at some point the fortunes change, and Amari Cooper probably has a much better game this week. We've just kind of seen the ridiculous volume, the Browns relying on Flacco, and I think this might be the week that he kind of puts it all together.
I like that, Josh. I like that. For the Bears side of things, Josh, one of my stronger stances this year that I haven't really let go of is that I've been above consensus on them for a while now. I believe they're 5-4 in their last 9. They're a couple plays away from being a 7-6 team that's right in the wild card race. Defense has been really good for over a month now. The addition of Montez Sweat has changed their pass rush. It's made everyone better. DJ Moore's been fantastic. I know we had doubts about, Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen. Like, that's been much closer to a parallel when Justin Fields is on the field than I think anyone really expected. What do you think about the Bears here, Josh?
Yeah, DJ Moore in games that Fields starts and finishes is the fantasy wide receiver 2 overall. Less positively, the running back usage is hard to predict. Week 12, Roschon Johnson, the rookie, is the bell cow, while playing alongside Khalil Herbert with Deonta Foreman sidelined with an ankle injury. Week 13, they have the bye. And then week 14, everything flips. Deonta Foreman returns. He handles the most carries. He runs the most routes, even though he's not much of a pass catcher. Khalil Herbert remains the number 2. And then Roschon Johnson gets bumped from the number 1 to the number 3. I'm very concerned. I don't really like this matchup in terms of the Browns against running backs. And I don't really like that. I think it might be Foreman again, but it really wouldn't surprise me if any of those 3 ended up being the lead back. So start of the fantasy playoffs, if you want some big upside, it's probably not going to come in the Bears backfield.
Yeah, it seems like risky scaling, terrible floor for all these guys. I do think the Bears will try to lean on the run if they can here because of the Browns' perimeter corners and pass rush. But I agree. I think this is going to be like a 13-10 type game. Real slobber knocker, if you will. Patriots versus Chiefs. Patriots are 10-point home underdogs. The game total here is 37.5 points. You got to give it to them. Impressive spike week against the Steelers from Bailey Zappi. Ezekiel Elliott may not blow the doors off you athletically anymore, but he's a professional football player that's really reliable in all phases. I know that's not like a fun thing to say, but that's the reality of the situation. That's why Belichick wanted him there in the first place. Defense continues to be good. There's still no reason to have any confidence in the offense here, and if this team's gonna hang here, they're gonna need to score a little bit. You have any optimism on that front, Josh?
Not really. A 10-point spread with a 37 game total suggests a blowout. And I guess the one positive is we could talk about Ezekiel Elliott having the largest running back workload in week 14. He was the only running back to this point in week 14. We do have 2 Monday night games, but I don't expect any of those 4 teams to let a running back handle literally 100% of the snaps like Zeke did. 22 carries, 68 rushing yards, 8 targets for a 31% target share. The most impressive was that he caught 7 of 8 targets for 72 yards and a touchdown. I think we might see that again this week against the Chiefs, where Zeke dump-offs are plentiful. They try to keep the game plan simple for Bailey Zappi. And despite Zappi going 240-3 last week, Zeke is really the only player in New England that I'm starting.
Yeah, agreed there. Definitely. I'm staying away from everyone else myself. On the Chiefs front, Josh, let's start with this. Kadarius Toney was so far off sides, he should probably have to do a little jail time for that penalty. I mean, the fact that anyone's angry about this is ridiculous. The drama fiasco. Like here's the thing. You've won 2 Super Bowls in the last 4 years. You went to the Super Bowl last year on a borderline late hit running out of bounds against the Bengals that basically put you in field goal position before overtime. And then you got that PI call late against the Eagles in the Super Bowl. The problem with the Chiefs is that their offense stinks, considering the standards that they've had since Patrick Mahomes took over. One call, seriously, stop, please stop doing this. That said, Bill Belichick would try to make the Chiefs play left-handed by focusing his macro game plan on Travis Kelce when they had Tyreek Hill. So he's definitely doing that this week. That means the Chiefs wide receivers are going to have to win this game. I'm a little concerned there. On the other hand, Josh, the Chiefs have lost 3 of their last 4, 2 in a row. This has not happened during the Mahomes era. This is an obvious bounce back spot, an obvious right the ship spot. It's just a question of do they win by 10 points or more. What are you thinking about KC here, pal?
Yeah, so let's talk about the running back usage. Isaiah Pacheco was out for week 14. We'll kind of monitor if he plays week 15, but Clyde Edwards-Helaire was the one who had 11 carries to McKinnon's 4. Clyde Edwards-Helaire ran 15 routes to McKinnon's 18. They each had a red zone carry. Helaire actually had 4 targets to McKinnon's 3. McKinnon is the one that scored. He happened to convert his red zone carry. I would still prefer CEH to McKinnon in fantasy should Pacheco miss again. Despite McKinnon getting in the box and having more fantasy points, the usage was pretty clearly in Edwards-Helaire's favor. And Ryan, you watch every snap of every game. Would you agree McKinnon does not look nearly as fast or explosive this year? Last year at stretches, I was like, you know what? I'm still seeing this plus athlete. I rewatched the game late last night just to kind of get my thoughts together. And I was once again just very underwhelmed with McKinnon. I think actually looked less explosive at times than Edwards-Helaire, which was crazy to be saying. And in terms of receivers stepping up, I do have some confidence, at least in Rashee Rice. He now has at least 9 targets, 7 catches, 64 yards in 3 straight games. He's averaging 20 fantasy points a game in that stretch. I think those numbers are going to be a little bit inflated. That's just a small 3-game sample, but I think it shows that at this point, Rashee Rice has broken through. He's the clear number 1 receiver. If I remember correctly, Marquez Valdes-Scantling is still under 20 receptions for this season, which is like kind of mind-blowing for the guy that like came into the season as the supposed wide receiver 1 for Patrick Mahomes. So yeah, I'd say this is going to be probably a big Rashee Rice game. But other than that, I agree. Little confidence in this Chiefs offense. It's becoming, in terms of what we think with Mahomes, I actually think it's been these past 4 games, they've been one of the hardest offenses to watch.
Yeah, I agree with that. First, Josh, I have a few things to say. MVS does have 19 catches on 37 targets for 295 yards, and he plays a lot too. So it's not like a playing time thing. Oh, and as you know, Josh, MVS maybe cost me $1 million by dropping that deep shot in the end zone a few weeks ago in prime time. So I'll never forgive MVS, that's for sure. To your running back question, yes, Jerick McKinnon, when he was a Viking, was a super explosive player. He wasn't quite that last year either. Had injuries when he went to the 49ers, so on, but he was better than what they had in the passing game phase. And I agree. I also think Clyde Edwards-Helaire was a more explosive player yesterday, which that's not really a compliment, guys. Next up, Panthers versus Falcons. Real exciting stuff here. Panthers are 3-point home underdogs. Game total here is 35 points. They just got smoked by the Saints last week, Josh. We talked about this. Like, can the Panthers win this game outright? Just because that was more of a bet against the Saints. The truth is, I don't think they can beat anyone outright. Evidently, that wasn't Frank Reich's fault. That seems to be a roster problem at this point. Do you have any positives to say about Carolina at all, Josh?
Yeah, we'll start with the positives. Both weeks since head coach Frank Reich's been fired, Chuba Hubbard's been the workhorse back over Miles Sanders. Falcons have generally been fairly stingy against fantasy running backs. We saw Rachaad White have a big game against him last week. Chuba's going to be somewhere in the fantasy RB2 conversation. I think what describes the Panthers offense is Jonathan Mingo. Jonathan Mingo has at least a 20% target share in 5 straight games. He's averaged 7.5 targets in that span. And yet, just 3 catches, 35 yards, under 7 fantasy points a game over the past 5 games, despite being the focal point of this pass attack. Thielen, the past 5 games, is also under 9 fantasy points. And he's actually been out-targeted. Thielen's been out-targeted by Mingo during that stretch. Thielen was kind of the one bright spot in the past game. At this point, Chuba Hubbard is a fantasy running back 2 type. I just am not going to start anybody in this pass game anymore. I don't know what to do. Thielen was getting there on volume. He looks tired. It's been a long season for the mid-30s product. And Jonathan Mingo is just bad at football.
Yeah, I mean, expecting him to be a wide receiver one for a full season was a pretty big ask. Let me say this to you guys too. It's playoff week for most of us. Starts in week 15. We have our free Discord. I'm gonna up how often I'm in it this week for start sit questions and so on. I'll do a pass Thursday afternoon. I'll do a pass Friday evening, and then Saturday evening again. And Kev Wheeler's a monster in there. You know, Kev Wheeler helps us out big time. So, Kev, me, Josh, will be in there trying to help you win your leagues this year. On the Falcon side of things here, Josh, oh man, no one wants to win this division still. Like the Falcons were showing some hope winning 2 in a row. Then they host Baker Mayfield's Buccaneers, and you know they can't get the job done here. I have no confidence in any team in this division, no faith whatsoever. The Saints have the best roster. They don't want to get it done. The Falcons have the second best roster. They don't want to get it done. However, shout out to Jordan Vanek. He told us he wanted to ladder Drake London receiving yards. I think London finished with 172 receiving yards yesterday. So pretty big hit there, Jordan. No surprise there. Any takeaways here for the Falcons offense, Josh?
Yeah, I thought Jordan was crazy. He wanted to play Ritter, London stacks, and DFS. So, of course, Ritter throws for nearly 350, passes for a touchdown, runs in a touchdown. London, like you said, 172 receiving yards, the most yesterday. However, that was against the Buccaneers. They're one of the best matchups for receivers. The Panthers are the second worst matchup for fantasy receivers this year, behind only the Jets. And it's not necessarily that they have this elite secondary. It's really that teams just run the piss out of the ball against the Panthers. I think it's going to be an efficient Bijan Robinson game. Panthers have given up an NFL high 17 rushing touchdowns to running backs. Tyler Algier wasn't involved in the passing game like Bijan. That's why Bijan had the massive fantasy day last week. But Bijan did have 10 carries. Algier had 9 last week. We have our ultimate fantasy football playoffs guide that we co-authored. That's on the 33rdteam.com site. It's free. There's nothing like it out there right now. Everyone should check that out. And I wrote up some unique flex options towards the bottom of that article. And Tyler Algier was one of my week 15 flex consideration options where he's getting a similar enough amount of carries to Bijan, and against this Panthers team where teams simply don't need to pass to win pretty handily. Algier is just the sneaky threat for 12 carries, 60, 70 yards, and a touchdown.
Yeah, speaking of that guy, Josh, I've been doing something like that for 5 years now. That's one of my favorite pieces to do. Josh did it with me this year, and it's the best it's ever been, in part because of that flex section. And like we talked about last week, Algier's my favorite option that you put in there. That's completely out of the box, and I think you're right. He has difference-making upside this week. Next up, Josh, the second iteration of Dolphins versus Jets. Dolphins are 12-point home favorites this time, 40.5-point game total here. You know, we'll see Miami tonight. We know what they are. Tyreek Hill's the offensive player of the year, maybe going to break the record for receiving yards in a single season. The Jets, you know, in winter pools, I wrote that I like the Jets as an upset option this week. I was expecting Houston to struggle offensively because they can't really run the ball and they're pass reliant. The Jets, you can run the ball on the Jets, but they have an excellent pass defense. It was terrible, disgusting weather here in the tri-state area. Wind, rain. I was not expecting 30 points of offense out of the Jets, however, Josh. I don't expect it to be more of an anomaly than the new norm, but you have any positives going forward for this offense?
The positives would just be that Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson get there in fantasy with Zach Wilson. We had those couple Tim Boyle weeks that were quite depressing, but
yeah,
what we saw last week from Garrett Wilson, 14 targets, 9 catches, 108 yards. That's definitely the ceiling, but the floor has not been all that bad either when he's been playing with Zach Wilson. He's kind of this middling to low end fantasy wide receiver 2 with Wilson this year. And then Breece Hall, fortunately, still has that outrageous receiving workload. Had nearly 90 receiving yards yesterday, and he needs that because Breece Hall has had 50 or fewer rushing yards every game since week 5 now. He is pretty much exclusively like an Austin Eckler type for fantasy.
Saints first Giants, Josh. Saints are 6-point home favorites, 36.5-point game total. We'll see the Giants tonight, Josh. On the Saints side, you know, like I said, I'd never backed off the Bears stance this year. I was enthusiastic about the Saints. Them and the Chargers are the two teams I'm the most disappointed in. I have backed off on the Saints. I've definitely adjusted them, thrown them in I think they were 20th in my power rankings last week. They scored 28 points against the Panthers, but they did not have a good game on offense. The defense, has struggled recently, but they did do their jobs last week against Carolina. Then again, everyone shuts down Carolina. Been a very bizarre season for this group where they have not taken advantage of a very easy schedule. Then again, this is a very winnable game against the Giants, and New Orleans is a tough place to play. What do you got here on the Saints offense, Josh?
Yeah, the Saints are one of 3 teams in the NFC South with a 6-7 record, but they are the only team with a positive point differential, so at least we can give them that. One thing that was a little concerning is that while the Giants have struggled against running backs all year, Alvin Kamara did not really break away from the pack last week against Jamal Williams. They split carries down the middle, 12-11. Kamara ran 16 routes to Jamal's 7. 16 routes is just not very many, considering Carr had around 30 dropbacks. So he's only running a route on about half of those. Kamara did seed a red zone carry as well. And you might be like, well, Josh, I saw the score. It was a blowout. Of course, it's Jamal Williams' game. And no, by quarter, the two were neck and neck for carries the entire game. And the Saints really blew it away at the very end of the game, where the fourth quarter they beat the Panthers 14-0. So it was actually a little bit closer for most of the game. Kamara's still a fantasy RB1, but the ceiling is going to be a little bit lower like it was last week where he only has 13 fantasy points if he's going to be in a pretty even carry split with Jamal, the veteran.
Next up, Josh, my least favorite game on the slate when I do expert picks on Thursday morning, when I do my betting preview on Saturday morning. This will be the game I have the least amount of confidence in. Packers versus Buccaneers. Packers are 3.5-point home favorites. Game total here is 42.5 points. They're very similar teams. You know, Green Bay, we'll see them tonight. Their offense is a different animal without Christian Watson, though. Buccaneers, you know, to their credit, to Baker Mayfield's credit, this team will just not die. They kept themselves in the NFC South race last week with their win against the Falcons. Rashad White had over 100 yards on the ground. That's a true rarity for this team. They've had a bottom 5 running game for 2 years in a row now. But White's trending up here, Josh. What do you think about this offense?
Yeah, he is trending up. He's now run for at least 84 yards in 3 straight games. I actually bet against him with his rushing yards last week. I got that wrong. He was still not super efficient, only 4 yards per carry, but pretty outrageous volume if they're giving him 25 carries in that one. Looks like it could be another game like that because the Packers are one of the more extreme run funnel defenses. So I've got some hope for Rashad White. I've got some hope that Mike Evans bounces back after only catching 1 of 6 targets last week. Chris Godwin, it was nice to see him lead the team in targets last week, but in this matchup, I think he goes back to what he's been all season, just this very low ceiling flex play.
Next up, Titans versus Texans. The Titans are 2-point home favorites right now because CJ Stroud's in the concussion protocol. 37.5-point game total here. Tennessee will see them tonight. For the Texans, I don't actually think that Houston's drawing dead here if they're without Stroud. Davis Mills isn't, the worst backup quarterback in the league, but obviously it's a monumental downgrade. My bigger concern here is no Nico Collins, no Tank Dell, plus no CJ Stroud that turns the Texans into, like a bottom 8 type team. What are you thinking here in Houston, Josh?
I have nothing positive to say about the Texans. It's hard to know each week now if it's going to be Dameon Pierce or Devin Singletary as the lead back. We've lost Tank Dell to a broken leg in week 13, Nico Collins to the calf in week 14. CJ Stroud is concussed. What does this mean? Derrick Henry shaping up for a massive, massive week 15. You'll see my fantasy rankings set the site tomorrow. I'm going to be ranking him pretty aggressively because this looks like the dream spot where we know they're division rivals. They want to beat the Texans. 25, 30 carries could be in store for the big dog in week 15.
Yeah, I think that's the thing here too, Josh, is Derrick Henry has absolutely destroyed Houston over the last few years. We're talking I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think it's 4 out of the last 5 games. He has 200 yards rushing. It's something absolutely absurd like that. That said, D'Amico Ryan's defense is an entirely different animal. I don't think the ceiling's quite as high as it has been in the past, but you're right. Positive game script, huge volume, definitely on the play for the big dog who just won't age. I think he's second in the league in rushing yards right now. Cardinals versus 49ers. Cardinals are 13.5-point underdogs. Game total here is 47. Arizona's coming off their bye. When they beat Pittsburgh before their bye, it was similar to how they beat Dallas. They were very physical in the trenches. They manhandled 2 very good defenses in that spot. 49ers will be a problem on passing downs. Their front 4 is just absolutely absurd. But a few times some teams have had surprising success on the ground here. against San Francisco this year. 49ers defense is a bit banged up here too. I don't have any confidence in Arizona manhandling the 49ers in the trenches, but a James Conner game is probably their best path to keeping this one close. What do you think here with the Cardinals offense, Josh?
Yeah, I don't have too many positive things to say. At least prior to the bye, we did see James Conner kind of take back that workhorse load, which he needs to be a fantasy RB2. Hollywood Brown's been incredibly inconsistent with Kyler. He's been targeted so deep down the field. The Niners have given up some big plays in the passing game. The only place they've struggled in terms of fantasy points allowed is against receivers this year. That's mostly just because teams trail early and often, so they have to throw a lot against the Niners. But overall, I think we're starting Connor. We're starting Hollywood Brown. And I'd say that Kyler Murray is going to be kind of a low-end fantasy QB1 with an incredibly low floor this week. What I'm thinking right now in terms of floor is the playoff game where, what was that, 2 years ago when Kyler, what was it? He had like 120 yards in that game or something.
Yeah.
That was one of the worst. It might have actually been the worst quarterback play I've ever seen from a starter in the NFL playoffs.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. Not this year. The Cardinals did a very good job in the draft this year. Previously, though, this is not a great roster. The 49ers have an enormous talent advantage here, just to be absolutely clear. That's why they're 13.5-point road favorites. And on the San Francisco side of things, Josh, so many people said that Brock Purdy's a system quarterback, but I think if you asked a lot of them, like, explain the system, I'm not sure they'd have a great answer to that. That's point one here, Josh. Two is Brock Purdy's not the first quarterback to benefit from a great supporting cast or head coach. When Patrick Mahomes entered the league, Andy Reid, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, pretty good supporting cast. I'm not comparing Brock Purdy to Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes is an entirely different animal out of structure. That said, Josh, if you doubt Brock Purdy, that Seahawks game is the one to go watch. He had 5 or 6 throws in that game that were just spectacular, high difficulty throws. He made a half, he was, I don't want to say he was the difference in that game because, again, no team goes as deep as Debo, Ayuk, Kittle, McCaffrey. They can beat you in every conceivable way. But Brock Purdy's a player himself, and he should be in the MVP conversation. And, there's a decent chance he's going to win it, too. What do you think about the 49ers offense here, Josh?
Yeah, Purdy is now at 9.9 yards per attempt. Tua's in second place with only 8.6. 2 weeks ago, I thought Purdy didn't do anything. He kind of got there on just big broken plays where Debo, Kittle, Ayuk getting loose downfield. But I agree. Last week, what we saw was a pretty high average throw depth, difficult throws, dropping them in the breadbasket. And yeah, I liked what I saw. Arizona's an elite matchup for these fantasy offenses. I will definitely be playing this game pretty heavily in DFS on the Niners side.
Yeah, just to be clear, he does benefit from, 5-yard drags to Debo that he runs for 30 yards. They're definitely part of the equation, but he's a good player on top of that too. Rams versus Commanders is next. Rams are 6.5-point home favorites here, 48.5-point game total. Stafford, man, he just kept the Rams in that game all that was a messy game, lit up the Ravens secondary. He could absolutely destroy this Commanders secondary, as we know, Josh. Like, this is the team to target. Rams run game is the most overachieving running game in recent memory for me. I'm so impressed by it. Shout out to Nick Botiford. You said something very smart, when we were talking about this Kyron Williams hit, that Nick Botiford should probably be a beat writer for the Rams. He's been very, very good with them this year. And, success like that against a team like Baltimore, the ceiling here against the Commanders is 400 passing yards. So what are you thinking here with the Rams, Josh?
Yeah, just to let people know what I'm doing on one of my fantasy teams where I now lost Justin Herbert. I am going to aggressively target Stafford on the waiver wire. That is my priority quarterback for this week. I think if he's out there on waivers for anyone, you should scoop him up. Wouldn't surprise me if he ends up being a top 6 fantasy quarterback in my rankings this week. We've talked about how the Commanders are the premier defense to target. It's not even close at this point. They're the number 1 matchup overall for quarterbacks and receivers, the number 7 matchup for running backs. And then even more positively for the Rams, Cooper Kupp is back. Not only did he have 10 targets, which was a team leading 26% share, not only did he catch 8 of them for 115 yards and a touchdown, but his average depth of target was back to a more normal range for him at 7.5 yards. It was only 3 yards in week 13. It was concerning. They weren't letting him go downfield. He looked injured. And I thought yesterday, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought Kupp looked a lot healthier. He had a couple catches that I was very impressed with. And I think he's back to just being an every week fantasy wide receiver 1, especially against Washington.
Yeah, I was shaking my head emphatically on that. Cooper Kupp did look like the old Cooper Kupp. I didn't really play very much at DFS last week, but I plugged him in a lineup as like a hope and not a hope and a prayer, but I thought that game, I actually really liked that game from a shootout potential if there was no weather. But yeah, he was big time ceiling here against the Commanders. Speaking of, Josh, Washington's coming off their bye. They desperately needed it. Rams defense lost him last week's game in Baltimore. That means Sam Howell, who was leading the league in passing yards not too long ago. I think that's, a little bit misleading, but he's had his moments this year. And I do think in a best case scenario, he could turn this game into a shootout. Do you have any faith in the Commanders offense here, Josh?
Yeah, I have some faith in Howell scoring fantasy points. That's about it. He's had at least 18 fantasy points in 6 straight. We've seen him distribute the ball to a lot of different receivers. It's why Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, Curtis Samuel aren't getting there in fantasy, even though Howell has been so good in terms of the raw counting stats. The one thing to note is that Brian Robinson had the hamstring injury from week 13. Then they had the bye. Should he miss, Antonio Gibson looks like a pretty strong fantasy start. I would expect the Rams to be leading for most, if not all, of this game. We know that Gibson has pretty massive receiving ability in terms of both volume and breaking big plays in space. So he's going to be kind of the X factor here, where if we assume Brian Robinson misses this game, the skill player I'd be most excited for wouldn't be Terry McLaurin. It would by quite a bit be Antonio Gibson for fantasy.
Interesting. Again, Josh, Kev Wheeler, Matthew Hill, fantasy rankings will be on the 33rdteam.com tomorrow afternoon. We've been talking about a bunch of mediocre games on this slate, and now we're going to close out with, 3 pretty solid ones. First up, Bills versus Cowboys. Bills are 1.5-point home favorites in this matchup, 48.5-point team total. Last week in Kansas City, coming off their bye, must-win game for Buffalo. Buffalo basically needs to win out to get into the playoffs. They came out hot. Real dicey second half offensively, kind of disappointing for me on a number of levels. They did walk away with a win. They're still very much in it. It's early. I do kind of lean towards Buffalo here in this spot just because of the desperation factor that Dallas, played a great game against Philly, maybe a letdown spot for them. You have anything to say about Buffalo's offense, Josh?
Yeah, I was curious what you think of Stephon Diggs. At this point, he's been under 7 fantasy points 3 of his past 4. Hasn't reached 100 receiving yards in 2 months. Is he looking like he's starting to show his age? He is now 30.
I've said this about Aaron Rodgers a number of times, Josh, that a number of receivers have benefited greatly from his association with him. Stephon Diggs was the number 2 receiver with the Vikings. Good player. He's been a top 5 producer in a large part because of his association with Josh Allen. I've always thought he's a touch overrated and good player, but I think if you put Amari Cooper in Buffalo and Stephon Diggs in Cleveland, I think their numbers, I don't think there would be a huge, massive disparity.
The one other note is Dalton Kincaid had 8 targets, 22% target share. He caught 5 of them for only 21 yards. Dawson Knox returned in this game. He only had 3 targets. So it looks like the split was mainly just ramping up the rookie early in the season, and that Kincaid still looks like an every week fantasy tight end 1 with the usage, despite Knox's return.
Yeah, I'll add to that, to the Chiefs' credit, because I bet on Kincaid's over yards, but not receptions. Just, gave up no yak, tackled him as soon as he caught the ball. On the Cowboys side, Josh, Dallas has played an excellent complete game against Philly last night. I first mentioned Dak Prescott as an MVP candidate, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago when he was 40-1 on that market. I have a ticket then. I also bought a ticket. I think it was at 20-1 odds when the market opened, just because I thought Dallas had a shot to be the NFC's number 1 seed. One thing I want to focus on here, Josh, is Rico Dowdle has popped on my radar a few times. He looks like a good little player. His 12 carries were real nice. That's encouraging. But when he got some of them, it was very curious to me. He got them in some pretty high leverage spots when the game was still close. So I'm curious what you think about Dallas's offense overall, and just about the team in general at this point.
Yeah, Dowdle's someone that I think at this point we can just kind of use as a flex play. The Bills have struggled for much of this year against running backs. Dowdle, as you've mentioned a few times now, has looked similar, if not better, to Pollard on the occasional carry, which I think is kind of an indictment on Pollard and also sort of shows that Rico Dowdle's a pretty competent backup. In terms of the overall offensive landscape, Dak now has multiple passing touchdowns in 7 straight games. He's probably going to make it 8 against the Bills here in what should be a decently high-scoring affair. And again, guys, Ryan got Dak 6 weeks ago at 40-1 to an MVP. Dak is now the MVP favorite on most major sports books. He's Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. His power rankings hit the site, the33rdteam.com, tomorrow. On Thursdays, his expert picks and predictions for every game come out. Saturdays, he lets you know what he's betting on. Fridays, we have the player prop happy hour. You need to stay plugged into all of Ryan's content. It's very, very, very high level. And we also co-authored that ultimate guide to the fantasy football playoffs. We'll make some minor updates to that this week, but I think most of what we laid out last week is still very, very true for this week. So I'm feeling pretty good about that product so far. And I think everyone out there should read that to check out our work together.
Yeah, that's I've said this a few times. I'm not a big hype guy because when I hype something, it means you should go check it out. Go check that out if you're in the fantasy playoffs. That's one of those things that we're going to crush that every year. Jaguars versus Ravens, Josh. Sunday night football. Jaguars are 3.5-point home underdogs. 43.5-point game total here. Simply put, Josh, the Jaguars defense is terrible right now. Absolutely terrible. Got shredded by Jake Browning. Got shredded by Joe Flacco. If Lamar Jackson's, I would say he's a distant third in the MVP race, but this is a way he can create some margin. If he has another spike week. On that front too, Josh, I do think the Jaguars are a little dangerous here. They actually beat Baltimore last year in a very close contested game. Trevor Lawrence is hurt though. He had 3 interceptions, just kind of like a messy game in Cleveland. What do you think about the Jaguars offense here?
Yeah, I think the Jaguars offense could struggle here, just like last week. I think the 3 passing touchdowns for Lawrence were the first time this year that he did that. That's exciting. I think the 3 interceptions are a little bit more telling that he's not quite healthy and that he might be missing Christian Kirk. The positive, though, is that when Christian Kirk is out, 3 guys succeed. Last week, we saw Zay Jones have 14 targets. We saw Ridley have 13 targets. We saw Evan Engram have 12 targets. Engram's the one that had 11 catches for 95 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's actually more production than Zay Jones and Ridley had combined, which is very interesting. But when the targets are consolidated to just 3 guys, and you know that the Jaguars will have to pass quite a bit against the Ravens, you can start all 3 of them in week 15. And I would also expect the fantasy points to even out. I do not believe Evan Engram is going to be outproducing Zay Jones and Ridley combined on less than half the targets each week. So, yeah, I think the needle's trending up for Zay Jones, trending up for Calvin Ridley, and it continues to be pretty high for Evan Engram.
On the Baltimore side here, Josh, I'm gonna go all over the place over here with you, pal. Last week, I said that through 12 weeks, or through 12 games rather, Lamar Jackson's season looks a lot like Daniel Jones from last season at that point. And, statistically, it's pretty close. That's why I thought it was clever, but like one thing that was surprised me during that is how many people read that as Daniel Jones is better than Lamar Jackson. Like, that's not what I think at all. In fact, the year before, in the preseason of the year Lamar Jackson won his MVP ticket, I bought 2 tickets at 50-1. I feel I have a pretty good grasp of who Lamar Jackson is, and what I'll say is I do think people double count when he has a good game as a passer. He's a dynamic runner. Him and Michael Vick are the 2 best in the history of the sport, but I don't think Lamar Jackson is an elite passer. I think he's more of an efficient game manager in that sense, where if they're going to go any further than they've had, they need more than that. And to this point, I don't really see the Ravens as being different than they have been in the last several years. To that point, I'm going to go through Jackson's big throws in this game. 20-yard pass to Odell Beckham, great find, but Beckham had to dive to get it. The 50-yard touchdown to Isaiah Likely, motion, uncovered. Again, Lamar Jackson found him, great find, but he was literally by himself downfield. The other big play, 46-yard touchdown, Beckham completely smoked his guy, had to dive into the end zone to catch it. Jackson airmailed a few deep shots last week too to guys that had 2 or 3 steps. The rain was a factor, and then that last drive, Lamar Jackson threw a great crosser to basically bring them into overtime. Great player. I think he had like 350 yards passing. I think that's a little bit misleading of what kind of day he had through the air. But again, great player, rock solid team. The Ravens are definitely a top 4, top 5 team. No questions there, but I don't think Lamar Jackson's doing as much as some people are portraying him as. That said, Josh, what are you thinking about the Ravens here?
Yeah, let's talk about their backfield. So it's messy. Jaguars have been a pass funnel defense. They're top 5 in passing yards allowed. They're bottom 5 in overall rushing yards allowed. I'm really just not interested in any of these Baltimore Ravens options for fantasy. We saw Justice Hill lead the team in snaps this past week, but he barely touched the ball. Keaton Mitchell led the team in touches, but then he still didn't get that many carries. He wasn't involved in the passing game. So I think what we saw prior to their bye, where we started to get a little bit excited, like, oh, is Keaton Mitchell going to take over snaps, carries, routes? That was a pretty emphatic no last week. It was very rainy. If there was ever going to be a game where they kind of expanded his role, it would have been yesterday against the Rams. So for week 15, when you're either in the fantasy playoffs or 1 week away from securing your spot in the Final Four, I would not be starting Keaton Mitchell in any format.
Let me ask you this question, Josh. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. And again, we'll answer questions in Discord. This is another smash. The Rams are a below average defense. I think the Jaguars are now too. Do you think this is another smash spot for Jackson and the main components of the Ravens passing attack?
Yeah, I think this is going to be another big game for them. Lamar did have his second game yesterday with at least 300 yards passing and 3 touchdowns.
Yep.
And I think we might be able to make it 3 this week, just given the matchup, where the Jaguars look like they just have no business stopping anyone through the pass game, but their run defense has been really stout throughout the year.
Yeah, I see it the same way. If I know I've gotten a few questions about whether or not you should start Lamar Jackson. That's why I brought it up. Just if you have Lamar Jackson, just start him this week. Don't even think about it. Seahawks versus Eagles on Monday night. Seahawks are 3.5-point home underdogs. Game total here is 48. They've had a very difficult schedule run over the last few weeks, and they've free-falled. They now have a sub-500 record. We've talked about that likelihood over the last few weeks. Drew Lock played better than I thought he was going to in San Francisco last week. That defense actually didn't play that bad. The 49ers just loaded, and Purdy played a very, very good game. I could see them losing to Philly here and then winning out against weaker opponents down the stretch and sneaking into the playoffs. With or without Geno Smith, Josh, what are you thinking here with the Seahawks offense?
Yeah, let's talk about the running back room. Eagles are the toughest matchup for fantasy running backs, and I did not like what I saw last week. Kenneth Walker had 8 carries. Zach Charbonnet had 9. Kenneth Walker surprisingly led the team with 22 routes run. Charbonnet only had 10. Ultimately, Walker had 8 carries, 5 targets, 9 fantasy points. Charbonnet had 9 carries, 1 target, 6 fantasy points. We're not going to be starting either of these guys against the Eagles with any confidence. With all 16 games happening this week, no teams on bye, I'm probably not going to have either of them in my top 24. And I think there's a slight chance neither cracks the top 30 either for fantasy rankings. So it's just really, really tough sledding for anyone out there that was hoping to count on Kenneth Walker or Zach Charbonnet.
Definitely agree. Eagles, Josh, losses to the 49ers and the Cowboys aren't at the end of the world. They're 10-3 now. Secondary needs to be better. No real reason to believe that that's going to happen at this point, though, which means that Jalen Hurts, and we talked about this before the season, that the tougher schedule we thought would lead to Jalen Hurts having to play in more negative game scripts. They could be more of a shootout team down the stretch. They finished the year with the Giants twice and the Cardinals, so smash spots there. Wide receivers didn't really have a great game in Dallas last week either. I think, this is like a classic, bounce back spot. Both of these teams kind of need a win here. So what are you thinking about the Eagles here, Josh?
It was Dallas Goedert's first game back. He was only targeted 4 times, but he caught all of them for 30 yards. That was a 14% target share. A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith combined for over 80% of the team's targets, which is kind of ridiculous. Brown had 13 targets. Smith had 10. I believe, top of my head, I think they both coughed up a fumble in that game as well, which is obviously not very good. But I think at least we always knew A.J. Brown were starting him every single week. There was a little bit of trepidation of Devonta Smith with Goddard back. At least last week, the target share, the yardage, it was all very promising. We'll kind of see how this game goes, but the Seahawks have struggled this year pretty mightily against receivers for fantasy football. So Devonta Smith still looks like he should be in the fantasy wide receiver 2 conversation in a good matchup. Folks, we have now covered all 16 games upcoming for week 15. We hope that these 2 Monday night games tonight to close out week 14 are exciting. From myself, Josh Larky, from my co-host Ryan Reynolds, from the 33rd team, thank you, everyone.